"Here, my lord. You look broken. Eat." The voice was brittle as frost-cracked wood, barely audible over the hammering rain. Adolphus Varker didn't move. He stood like a monument carved from violence itself, rain streaming off the segmented plates of his black leather armor. His massive frame cast a shadow that swallowed the narrow cobblestone street whole. The umbrella above him, held by a guard whose hand trembled despite years of training, did nothing to shield the weight that pressed down on his shoulders, a weight no armor could bear. His beard was thick and war-worn, tied with leather cords that matched the bindings in his long hair. Scars mapped his knuckles like territorial borders. His eyes, sunken and hollow beneath heavy brows, held the kind of exhaustion that sleep could never cure. This was Adolphus Varker, the Alpha King. The man who had unified the wolf packs through blood and iron. The ruler whose name made grown warriors wet themselves. And he was being offered charity. Behind him, his personal guard, Rolf Skeldrath and two others, stood rigid as iron pillars, their hands on sword hilts, eyes scanning for threats. They were trained to kill at a whisper. They'd seen their king tear through enemy battalions without breaking stride. But they weren't prepared for this. Adolphus looked down. An old woman stood before him in the downpour, soaked to the bone. Her gray dress clung to her frail frame like grave clothes, patches upon patches barely holding together. Her hair, once perhaps brown or gold, now hung in thin silver strands plastered against her weathered face. She was bowing not in fear, but in something far more dangerous, compassion. In her trembling, age-spotted hand, she held a single gold coin. It caught the firelight from the street braziers, glinting like a tiny sun in the storm. She wasn't begging. She was giving. A coin. Adolphus's voice was like stone grinding against stone. He hadn't spoken a gentle word in a decade. The kingdom had learned to fear even his silence. "For food, my lord," the old woman said, her accent thick with the rural drawl of the outer territories. When a soul carries that much gray in their eyes, it means they're starving. Not in the belly, but here. She touched her own chest with a gnarled finger. "You are the grayest man I have ever seen." Adolphus felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation so foreign it took him a moment to recognize it. Pain. Not from a blade. From something worse. He stared at the coin. It was old. Tarnished. The kind of coin someone kept hidden in a shoe for emergencies. The kind of coin that meant the difference between eating and starving. Between living and dying. He looked up, searching for where she'd come from, and his gaze landed on a collapsing shack at the edge of the market district. No door. Roof half-caved. A single candle burning in the window. That's where she lives. His jaw tightened. Behind him, Rolf shifted, hand tightening on his blade. "Your Majesty, should I?" "No." The word was a growl, low and absolute. Adolphus extended his massive, scarred palm. The old woman placed the coin into it as though she were crowning him. The metal was warm from her body heat. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "Otsana, my lord. Otsana Ravaran." She smiled, and despite the ruin of her teeth and the gauntness of her face, it was the most genuine smile Adolphus had seen in years. "Please, use it well. A man as broken as you needs more than gold. He needs to remember what it feels like to be cared for." Before he could respond, she bowed again, deeper this time, and turned, shuffling back toward her shack, her bare feet splashing through puddles of filthy water. Adolphus stood frozen, the coin burning a hole in his palm. His guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger soldier named Fenric, whispered, "Sire, she's clearly mad. We should find out why she's starving." The command was ice. Absolute. Rolf Skeldrath, captain of the King's Guard, stepped forward. He was a scarred wolf of a man, built like a siege tower, with eyes that missed nothing. He was the only one in the kingdom who'd known Adolphus before the wars. Before the crown. Before the breaking. "My lord, that woman just gave me her last coin." Adolphus's voice was tight, controlled, but beneath it was something raw. Something bleeding. Find out why an elder in my kingdom has nothing left. Find out who let this happen. Rolf's eyes widened slightly, the closest thing to shock the stoic warrior ever showed. At once, Your Majesty. As the guards peeled away into the shadows to begin their investigation, Adolphus remained standing in the rain, staring at the coin in his hand. The kingdom feared him. They called him the Iron Wolf, the Blood King, the Unbroken. But this old woman, this frail, starving woman, had looked at him and seen something else entirely. She'd seen someone who needed help. For the first time in 10 years, Adolphus Varker felt something other than rage or emptiness. He felt ashamed. The rain showed no mercy as Adolphus followed at a distance, his cloak pulled low over his armor. Rolf walked beside him, silent as a ghost. They watched as Otsana Ravaran returned to her shack, if it could even be called that. The door was a plank of rotted wood leaning against the frame. Inside, there was no furniture. No fire. Just a pile of rags in the corner that served as a bed. She sat down on those rags, pulled her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes. She has nothing, Rolf murmured. Not even food. Adolphus's fists clenched. How long has she been like this? I'll find out. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, 3 men appeared at the end of the alley. They wore the colors of the tax collectors, royal blue sashes with the king's crest embroidered in gold thread. But their swagger was wrong. Their smiles too cruel. The leader, a pot-bellied man with a waxed mustache, kicked open Otsana's door. Time to pay up, old hag, he bellowed, his voice slurred with drink. Lord Vokraine wants his due, and he wants it now. Otsana scrambled to her feet, trembling. I already paid this month, sir. I gave everything I had. Not enough. The man grabbed her by the collar of her dress and yanked her forward. You're 2 months behind now. Lord Vokraine says if you don't pay, we take the shack. Or maybe we take you to work off the debt in his kitchens. One of the other men laughed, a wet, ugly sound. She's too old for the kitchens, Gregor. But I bet she's got family somewhere. Maybe we find and... The laugh cut off. Adolphus stepped into the candlelight, rain pouring off his armor like a waterfall. His eyes glowed in the dark, not with magic, but with the kind of fury that made battlefields fall silent. The 3 men froze. Repeat that, Adolphus said softly. Gregor's face went white. The royal crest on his sash suddenly felt like a noose. Why, Your Majesty, we didn't. We were just. You were just extorting an old woman in my name. The words fell like an executioner's axe. Gregor dropped to his knees, hands raised. My lord, please, we serve Lord Vokraine. He told us the taxes were your orders. We were just following. Vokraine. The name tasted like poison. Adolphus reached into his pouch and pulled out the coin Otsana had given him. He held it up to the candlelight. This woman gave me her last coin because she thought I was starving. She has nothing, not because of war, not because of famine, but because men like you steal from her in my name. He stepped closer, and Gregor whimpered. I want you to deliver a message to Boris Vokraine, Adolphus said, his voice a low, lethal purr. Tell him the Alpha King is awake. And he's hungry. Then, faster than the eye could follow, Adolphus grabbed Gregor's wrist and twisted. The snap echoed through the alley like a gunshot. Gregor screamed, clutching his broken arm, and his companions scattered into the night like rats. Adolphus turned to Otsana, who stood trembling in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. He knelt before her, this massive, armored king kneeling in the mud, and placed the gold coin back into her hand. Then he pulled a leather pouch from his belt and set it beside her. This is not charity, he said quietly. This is a debt I owe. You fed a starving man tonight. Now let me feed you. Otsana's eyes filled with tears. My lord, I don't understand. You will. Adolphus rose to his full height, rain streaming down his face. Rolf. Take her to the castle. She is under my protection now. Otsana gasped. The castle? But I'm nobody. "You're somebody," Adolphus said, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long dead. "You're the woman who reminded me what a king is supposed to be." As Rolf gently led Otsana away, Adolphus stood alone in the rain, staring at the shack, at the poverty, at the rot festering in his kingdom. For years, he'd been so consumed with holding the throne, with crushing enemies, with maintaining order through fear, that he'd forgotten to look down. He'd forgotten his people. But now he saw them. And what he saw ignited a fire in his chest that no battlefield had ever sparked. "Boris Vokraine," he whispered to the storm. "I'm coming for you." Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The rain had turned the cobblestones into mirrors, reflecting the torchlight in fractured, dancing patterns. Adolphus stood motionless, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. The coin sat in Otsana's outstretched palm, glinting like a tiny accusation. Time seemed to crystallize around that single moment. Behind him, he heard the sharp intake of breath from Fenric, the youngest of his guard. Then came the whisper of steel as Rolf's hand moved to his sword hilt. The message was clear: this woman has insulted the king. She must be punished. Stand down. The words left Adolphus's mouth before his mind fully processed them. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of command that had ended rebellions and shattered shield walls. Rolf froze mid-draw. Fenric's hand hovered over his blade, confusion written across his young face. The old woman didn't move. She simply stood there in the downpour, her arm extended, the coin offered like a benediction. Rain ran in rivulets down her weathered face, tracing the deep lines that years of hardship had carved into her skin. Her eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, held no fear. Only a terrible, aching kindness. "My lord." Rolf's voice was carefully neutral, but Adolphus could hear the question beneath it. "What are you doing?" What was he doing? For 10 years, Adolphus had maintained his power through calculated brutality. He'd learned early that mercy was mistaken for weakness, that compassion was a crack in the armor that enemies would exploit. The kingdom feared him because fear kept them alive. Fear kept them unified. Fear kept them from tearing each other apart the way they had before he'd claimed the throne through blood and iron. He'd become exactly what the kingdom needed, a monster. And monsters didn't accept charity from old women in the rain. But something in that moment, something in the way she looked at him, past the armor and the scars and the reputation, pierced through every defense he'd built. She wasn't seeing the Alpha King. She wasn't seeing the Iron Wolf or the Blood Crown or any of the other names whispered in taverns and war camps. She was seeing a broken man. And she pitied him. Adolphus's hand moved of its own accord. Slowly, as though the air had turned to honey, he extended his massive palm. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles, some from blades, some from claws, one particularly nasty burn from wildfire during the siege of Karst. His hand could crush a man's skull, could snap bone like kindling, could sign death warrants with the flick of a quill. Otsana placed the coin in his palm with the gentleness of someone placing a crown on a king's head. The metal was warm, body warm. She'd been clutching it, probably for hours, working up the courage to approach him. "You look broken, my lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drum of rain on cobblestone. "Please, eat something warm. Fill the emptiness." Adolphus stared at the coin. It was old, older than the current kingdom's currency. The edges were worn smooth, the stamp nearly faded. But he could just make out the image, a wolf's head in profile, surrounded by stars. A coronation coin. They'd minted thousands of them 20 years ago when he'd first claimed the throne, distributing them to the populace as a symbol of the new order. Most had been melted down or lost. The fact that this woman had kept one, hidden away all these years, and was now giving it back to him. The irony was a knife between his ribs. "This is yours," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You should keep. I've kept it long enough." Otsana smiled, and despite the ruin of her teeth and the hollow of her cheeks, there was something luminous in that expression. I saved it for an emergency. For the day I would need it most. She tilted her head, studying him with those pale, knowing eyes. Today, you needed it more than I did. Adolphus felt his jaw tighten. His throat constricted. These were sensations he hadn't experienced in a decade, the physical precursors to emotion. To weakness. He looked up, desperate to escape the weight of her gaze, and his eyes found the source of her journey. Across the market square, half hidden in shadow, was a structure that barely deserved the name shack. The roof had partially collapsed, covered with a piece of rotted canvas. The walls leaned at dangerous angles. There was no door, just a gap covered by a threadbare blanket. That's where she lives. That's where one of my subjects lives. The thought hit him like a warhammer to the chest. Where do you live? He asked, though he already knew. Otsana gestured vaguely toward the shack, as though embarrassed. It's not much, but it keeps the worst of the rain off. How long? My lord. How long have you lived like that? She hesitated, her smile faltering. 3 years, Your Majesty. Since my husband died in the border wars. She said it without accusation, simply stating a fact. He served under Captain Rolf. Died bravely, they told me. Behind Adolphus, Rolf made a sound, something between a cough and a grunt. The captain remembered. Of course he did. Rolf remembered every man who fell under his command. His name? Adolphus demanded. Gavril Reverend's sire. A spearman in the 3rd Company. Adolphus closed his eyes. He knew the battle. The border skirmish of 23, though skirmish was a politician's word for what had actually been a bloodbath. They'd been outnumbered 3-1, caught in a canyon pass with no retreat. 140 men had gone in. 23 had come out. He'd written the letters himself. All 117 of them. Your husband died with honor. The kingdom owes him a debt that can never be repaid. Standardized words. Diplomatic words. Words that meant nothing when your husband was dead and you were left with nothing but a collapsing shack and a 20-year-old coin. You're a widow of war, Adolphus said, his voice tight. You should be receiving a pension. Land. Protection. Otsana's laugh was bitter but not unkind. Should be, my lord. But the papers got lost. The officials said there was no record. Said I must be mistaken about my husband's service. She shrugged, the gesture heartbreaking in its resignation. I'm just an old woman. Who listens to old women? I do. The words came out harder than he intended, sharp as drawn steel. Otsana flinched slightly, and immediately Adolphus regretted his tone. But before he could soften it, before he could explain, she bowed a deep, formal bow that nearly put her forehead to the wet cobblestones. Thank you, my lord, for accepting my gift, for seeing me. Her voice cracked on the last word. Most days, I think I'm invisible. It's nice to be seen. Then she turned, moving with the careful slowness of someone whose body had betrayed them long ago, and began walking back toward her shack. Adolphus watched her go, the coin burning in his palm like a coal. Around him, the market square was empty. The rain had driven most people indoors, but he suspected his presence had helped clear the streets. People didn't linger when the Alpha King was about. They scattered like mice before a wolf. As they should, part of him thought automatically. But another part, a part he'd thought long dead, whispered something different. They shouldn't have to fear their own king. Sire. Rolf's voice was low, meant only for Adolphus's ears. What are your orders? Adolphus looked at the coin. At the faded wolf and stars. At the symbol of hope he'd offered his people 20 years ago. Find out everything, he said quietly. Her husband's service record. Why her pension was denied. Who denied it? He paused, his jaw working. And find out how many others are living like this. My lord, with respect, there are always poor. Not like this. Adolphus turned to face his captain, and Rolf took an involuntary step back at the intensity in his king's eyes. War widows should not be starving in ruins while wearing rags. Not in my kingdom. Not while I draw breath. Rolf stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. It will be done. Discreetly, Rolf. I want to know the truth, not the version that bureaucrats think I want to hear. Understood. As Rolf and the other guards melted into the shadows to begin their investigation, Adolphus remained standing in the rain, alone with his thoughts. He opened his palm and stared at the coin again. Such a small thing. Such an insignificant piece of metal. But it represented something he'd lost along the way to holding on to power, the reason he'd fought for the throne in the first place. Not for glory. Not for legacy. To protect the pack. And he'd failed them. The rain poured harder, but Adolphus didn't move. He stood there in the downpour, water streaming off his armor, and for the first time in 10 years, he let himself feel the full weight of his isolation. The old woman was right. He was broken. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be fixed. He closed his fist around the coin and began walking, not back toward the castle, but toward the slums where Otsana had disappeared. He needed to see. Needed to understand. Needed to know just how blind he'd been. The slums of the lower quarter had always existed on the edges of Adolphus's awareness, a vague concept, a problem to be addressed, eventually, a byproduct of war and recovery that would sort itself out given time. He'd signed relief edicts, allocated funds for reconstruction, ordered tax exemptions for the poorest districts. On parchment, he'd been a generous king. But parchment lied. Adolphus moved through the narrow alleys like a shadow, his dark armor blending with the night despite its bulk. Years of warfare had taught him how to move quietly when necessary, how to become invisible even in plain sight. The guards had dispersed per his orders, giving him the solitude he needed to see his kingdom without the filter of ceremony and pretense. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning the unpaved streets into rivers of mud and refuse. The smell hit him first, raw sewage, rotting garbage, the sour stench of too many bodies living in too little space. He'd smelled worse on battlefields, but at least battlefields had the excuse of war. This was supposed to be peace. Otsana's shack sat at the end of a dead-end alley, wedged between two larger structures that looked ready to collapse at any moment. Up close, it was worse than he'd initially thought. The walls were constructed from scavenged wood pieces of broken carts, demolished doors, splintered fence posts, nailed together in a desperate attempt at shelter. The canvas roof had more holes than fabric, doing nothing to keep out the rain. Through the gap that served as an entrance, Adolphus could see inside. There was nothing. No furniture. No table. No chair. Just a pile of rags in the corner that he realized with dawning horror was her bed, and a small tin cup placed strategically under one of the many leaks in the roof. The cup was already overflowing, water spilling onto the dirt floor. Otsana sat on her pile of rags, hugging her knees to her chest. She was shivering, whether from cold or something else, Adolphus couldn't tell. Her lips moved silently, and he realized she was praying. Not for food. Not for warmth. She was praying for him. And please, Great Mother, watch over our king. He carries such weight. Such terrible weight. Let him find peace. Let him find rest. Let him remember that he is more than the crown he wears. Adolphus felt something crack inside his chest. Not the small fissure from earlier, but a complete fracture, a breaking open of walls he'd spent years reinforcing. This woman, this starving, forgotten, abandoned woman, had given him her last coin and was now using her breath to pray for his well-being. While he stood in armor worth more than she'd see in a lifetime. While she sat in a hovel that wouldn't shelter a dog. While his castle had 50 rooms he'd never even entered. The injustice of it was suffocating. He pulled back from the entrance, pressing his back against the wall of the adjacent building. His hand found the coin in his belt pouch, his fingers tracing its worn edges. The rain poured down his face, mixing with something else he refused to acknowledge. Movement caught his eye. Further down the alley, Three figures emerged from the shadows. Even at a distance, Adolphus recognized the swagger, the casual cruelty in their posture. Tax collectors. Or at least, men wearing the colors of tax collectors, the royal blue sashes that marked them as operating under the king's authority. His authority. Adolphus melted deeper into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. Old instincts took over, the hunter's stillness, the predator's patience. He watched as the three men approached Otsana's shack, their voices carrying clearly in the rain-soaked night. "This is the one," the lead man said. He was tall and pot-bellied, with a waxed mustache that glistened in the dim light. Gregor, Adolphus remembered the name from earlier. The widow who thinks she can skip payments. "She's got to have something," another said, younger, with a cruel mouth and nervous eyes. "Everyone's got something." "Not this one," the third chimed in, a scarred brute with hands like hammers. "We've checked. She's dry. But Lord Vokraine says examples need to be made. Says the others are getting ideas about withholding payment." Lord Boris Vokraine. The name had come up before, during Adolphus's earlier confrontation. A regional administrator, if memory served. Someone he'd appointed to manage the lower quarters' reconstruction efforts after the war. Someone who was apparently using that position to extort the people Adolphus had ordered him to help. "So, what's the play?" the young one asked. Gregor smiled, and it was the smile of a man who enjoyed his work. "We take what we can. Break what we can't. And if she complains," he cracked his knuckles. "Well, old women fall down a lot, don't they? Accidents happen." The three men laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. Adolphus's hand moved to his sword, but he forced himself to remain still. He needed to see this. Needed to understand the full scope of what was happening in his name. Gregor kicked open the entrance to Otsana's shack, the blanket tearing away from its moorings. "Up, old woman. Lord Vokraine's tax collectors are here for what's owed." Otsana scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, sirs, I've already paid this month. I gave everything." "Not enough." Gregor grabbed her by the arm, his thick fingers digging into her fragile flesh. Otsana cried out, and the sound cut through Adolphus like a blade. "You're 2 months behind. 3 if we count the processing fee." "Processing fee? But there was never." "Are you calling me a liar?" Gregor shook her hard enough to make her teeth rattle. "That's slander against a royal official. That's a crime." The younger collector began pawing through Otsana's meager possessions, kicking aside her rags, overturning the tin cup. "There's nothing here, Gregor. She's broke." "Then we take her," Gregor said simply. "Lord Vokraine can always use more workers in his kitchens. Or his other establishments." The way he said "other establishments" made the implication crystal clear. Otsana's face went pale. "No, please. I'm too old. I can't." "Should have thought of that before you decided to withhold the king's taxes." "The king would never." Gregor's backhand caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side. She crumpled to the ground like a broken doll, a thin line of blood trickling from her split lip. "Don't you speak about the king," Gregor snarled. "The Alpha King doesn't care about the likes of you. He takes what he wants, and right now, he wants his gold. If you can't pay in coin, you'll pay in labor." He reached down to grab her again, his fingers extended toward her throat. Those fingers never made contact. Adolphus moved. One moment he was 20 feet away, cloaked in shadow. The next he was there, his gauntlet hand clamping around Gregor's wrist like a vice. The collector had time for one startled yelp before Adolphus twisted. The snap was sharp and clean, the sound of bone breaking, of justice delivered in its purest form. Gregor's scream echoed off the alley walls, raw and animal. He dropped to his knees, cradling his ruined wrist, his face gone gray with shock. The other 2 collectors stumbled backward, their hands fumbling for weapons, their eyes wide with terror as they finally saw who had emerged from the darkness. The Alpha King. In full armor. Absolutely furious. "You," Adolphus said, His voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of mountains, just struck a war widow. "In my name." The young collector's bladder gave out. The smell of urine mixed with the rain. "Why, Your Majesty, we didn't. We were just," Lord Vaucrane said. Lord Vaucrane. Adolphus stepped over Gregor's whimpering form, moving toward the two men who were now pressed against the alley wall, trapped like rabbits before a wolf. "Tell me about Lord Vaucrane." He's the regional administrator, sire. He handles the tax collection for the lower quarter." I know what his title is," Adolphus interrupted. "I want to know what he's doing. And I want the truth. Because if you lie to me," he reached down and grabbed Gregor by his broken wrist, squeezing just enough to make the man scream again. "You'll wish you'd only lost a hand." The young one broke first, words spilling out in a panicked rush. "He's skimming, Your Majesty. Taking half the taxes for himself and reporting the rest as what was collected. He told us the relief edicts you signed were just for show, that you didn't really mean them, that you expected your administrators to be creative with the implementation." "Creative," Adolphus repeated, his voice flat. He said the lower quarter was full of parasites anyway. That they deserved whatever they got. That the strong survive and the weak fall, and that's the alpha way. Stop. The word was absolute. Final. The young collector's mouth snapped shut. Adolphus turned to look at Otsana, who was still on the ground, one hand pressed to her bleeding lip, her eyes wide with disbelief. He knelt before her, this king, this legend, this monster, and reached into his belt pouch. He pulled out the coronation coin and pressed it back into her palm. Then he pulled out a leather purse heavy with gold and placed it beside her. "This is not charity," he said quietly, echoing the words he'd said earlier. "This is payment. For 20 years of service through your husband. For your sacrifice. For your faith." His jaw tightened. "And for my failure to protect you as I swore to do." Otsana stared at the gold, then at him, tears streaming down her weathered face. "My lord, I don't understand." "You gave me the gift of sight," Adolphus said. "You showed me what I'd become too blind to see. That debt can never be repaid in gold." He stood, turning back to the three collectors. "But some debts can be paid in justice." He grabbed Gregor by the collar and hauled him to his feet with one hand. The man dangled like a child, whimpering and pleading. "Take a message to Lord Vaucrane," Adolphus said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "Tell him the Alpha King is awake. Tell him I'm coming. And tell him to pray that I'm feeling merciful when I arrive." He threw Gregor into the other two collectors, sending all three sprawling into the mud. "Run." They ran, slipping and stumbling in their panic, their screams fading into the rain-soaked night. Adolphus turned back to Otsana, who was clutching the gold to her chest, her whole body trembling. He saw the fear in her eyes now, not of him, but of the implications, the sudden attention, the weight of royal favor. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said gently. "My castle. You'll be under my protection. No one will touch you. No one will threaten you. And tomorrow," his expression hardened. "Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation with Lord Vaucrane about the meaning of justice." Otsana opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't a request. It was the decree of a king who had finally remembered what he was supposed to be. A protector. Not a monster. Adolphus scooped her up in his arms as though she weighed nothing, ignoring her startled gasp. She was so light, so frail. How long had it been since she'd eaten a proper meal? How long had she been surviving on scraps and prayers? Too long. He carried her through the rain-soaked alleys, his armor shielding her from the worst of the downpour. Behind him, the slums stretched out in the darkness, hundreds of shacks like Otsana's, hundreds of forgotten souls living in squalor, while he sat in a palace built on their suffering. The coronation coin pressed against his chest, tucked safely in his armor. A reminder. A promise. The Alpha King was indeed awake. And Boris Vaucrane's reckoning was coming. The castle gates loomed ahead, massive iron constructs that had repelled 3 separate siege attempts during the Unification Wars. Guards snapped to attention as they recognized their king, their expressions shifting from alert to shocked as they registered the elderly woman cradled in his arms. "Open the gates," Adolphus commanded, "and summon Rolf to the Great Hall." Immediately. "Yes, your majesty." The gates groaned open, and Adolphus strode through into the outer bailey. Servants and soldiers alike scattered before him, their curiosity palpable but their training keeping them silent. Good. He had no patience for questions right now. Otsana had gone rigid in his arms, her eyes wide as she took in the castle's grandeur. The torches lining the walls cast everything in warm, golden light, such a stark contrast to the cold darkness of the slums. The stone was clean, well-maintained. The banners bearing the wolf's head crest hung proudly from every wall. This was power made manifest. This was the seat of the Alpha King. And it was built on the suffering of people like the woman he carried. "My lord," Otsana whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I shouldn't be here. People like me don't." "People like you built this kingdom," Adolphus interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your husband bled for it. You've suffered for it. You have more right to be here than half the nobles who dine at my table." He carried her through the main doors and into the great hall. The space was vast, designed to hold hundreds during formal gatherings. Tonight it was empty save for a few servants tending to the massive hearth that dominated the far wall. The fire blazed, casting dancing shadows across the stone floor. Adolphus set Otsana down gently in one of the high-backed chairs near the hearth, the kind of chair reserved for visiting dignitaries and honored guests. She looked absurdly small in it, like a child playing at being royalty. Her ragged dress left muddy streaks on the fine upholstery, her wet hair dripped onto the floor, but Adolphus didn't care. "Bring food," he ordered the nearest servant, a young woman who was staring at Otsana with barely concealed confusion. A full feast. Soup, bread, roasted meat, vegetables, wine, everything. "And bring it now." "Why, yes, your majesty." "Right away." As the servant scurried off, Adolphus knelt before Otsana's chair, removing his gauntlets so he could inspect the damage Gregor had done. Her lip was split, but not badly, already beginning to swell. A bruise was forming on her cheek where she'd been struck. His jaw tightened. "I'm going to ask you questions," he said quietly. "And I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that?" Otsana nodded, still looking terrified, but also oddly resolute. "How often do Folkrain's collectors come?" "Every week, my lord. Sometimes twice." "And how much do they demand?" "It varies." She swallowed hard. "Sometimes 5 silver. Sometimes 10. Once they demanded a full gold piece." Adolphus's eyes narrowed. According to his tax codes, someone in Otsana's situation, a war widow with no income or property, should be paying nothing. The relief edicts he'd signed specifically exempted the poorest citizens from taxation until the kingdom had fully recovered from the war. "And if you can't pay, they take things. Anything they can find." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And if there's nothing to take, they take people. Mostly young women. They say it's to work off debts in Lord Folkrain's estates, but everyone knows what really happens there." A cold fury settled over Adolphus, the kind that came before the killing. "How many?" "I don't know, my lord. Dozens, maybe. The younger ones disappear. No one sees them again." "And no one reported this?" Otsana laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Report to who?" "The collectors work for Lord Folkrain." "Lord Folkrain works for you. Who would listen to people like us?" The words hit like hammer blows. She was right. The system he'd built, the hierarchy he'd established, it was designed to flow downward. Orders from the king, through the regional administrators, to the people. But information? Complaints? Justice? Those were supposed to flow upward, but somewhere along the way, the channels had been blocked. Corrupted. Turned into tools of oppression instead of protection. "I'm listening now," Adolphus said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't bother hiding. "And I swear to you, Otsana Ravrin, by the crown I wear, by the blood I've spilled, by everything I hold sacred, this ends tonight." The doors to the great hall burst open. Rolf Skeldrath strode in, rain still dripping from his armor, his expression grim. Behind him came two other guards, and between them, Adolphus's eyes widened slightly. They'd brought a prisoner. A thin, weaselly man in a clerk's robes, his face pale with terror. The man's eyes darted around the hall, landing briefly on Otsana before quickly looking away. "Your Majesty," Rolf said, bowing briefly. "As ordered, I've been conducting inquiries. I found this one trying to burn records in the administrative building." He shoved the clerk forward, sending him sprawling on the stone floor. "His name is Petrick. He's one of Folkrain's record keepers." Adolphus stood slowly, his full height and presence seeming to fill the hall. He looked down at the trembling clerk with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. "Burning records," he said softly. "Why would you do that, Petrick?" I was just following orders, Your Majesty. Lord Folkrain said to dispose of old documentation, to make room for new." "Liar." The word cracked like a whip. Petrick flinched. "You were burning evidence," Adolphus continued, circling the clerk like a wolf around wounded prey. "Evidence of embezzlement, of false taxation, of crimes committed in my name." He stopped directly in front of the man. "Tell me about the relief edicts." "I don't know what." Adolphus's hand shot out, grabbing Petrick by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The clerk's feet kicked uselessly as he clawed at the iron grip, cutting off his air. "Let me be very clear," Adolphus said, his voice deadly calm. "I am not interested in games. I am not interested in loyalty to your master. I am interested in the truth. And you are going to give it to me, or I'm going to let Rolf extract it using methods that will make you beg for the mercy of a quick death." He released his grip just enough to let Petrick gasp in air. "The edicts," Petrick wheezed. "Lord Folkrain intercepted them. He told us they were suggestions, not orders. He said the kingdom needed revenue, that you couldn't possibly mean for the poorest districts to pay nothing. So he rewrote them. Changed the implementation guidelines, Your Majesty. He said you'd never know, that you didn't care about the details." Adolphus dropped him. Petrick collapsed in a heap, coughing and gasping. "Where's Folkrain now?" "His estate, most likely. He has a gathering tonight. All the regional administrators and their..." Petrick hesitated. "Their what?" "Their entertainments, my lord. He hosts parties. Lavish ones. Paid for with stolen taxes," Rolf added darkly. Adolphus turned to look at Otsana, who sat in her chair by the fire, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. She looked so small, so fragile, so utterly out of place in the grandeur of the great hall. But there was something else in her expression now, something like hope. The servants returned then, bearing trays laden with food. Roasted chicken, fresh bread still steaming from the ovens, a rich vegetable stew, cheese, fruit, and a carafe of wine. They set it all on a small table beside Otsana's chair, their movements efficient despite their obvious confusion about who this ragged woman was and why their king was treating her like royalty. Adolphus walked back to Otsana and knelt before her chair once more. "Eat," he said gently. "Please. You offered me sustenance when I needed it most. Let me return the favor." Otsana's eyes filled with tears. "My lord, this is too much. I can't possibly." "You can. You will." His voice softened further. "And while you eat, while you're warm and safe, I want you to think about something." "What, my lord?" "Think about what justice looks like. Because tomorrow, I'm going to give you a choice." He glanced back at Petrick, then at Rolf. "You can stay here, safe and protected, and let me handle Folkrain my way. Or," he paused, seeing something kindle in her pale eyes. "Or you can stand beside me when I confront him. You can look him in the eye and let him know that his crimes didn't go unnoticed. That the people he crushed have a voice. You would let me?" Otsana whispered, disbelief and something fiercer warring in her expression. You gave a starving man your last coin, Adolphus said. You showed more courage in that moment than most warriors show in battle. Yes, Otsana Ravarin. I would let you stand beside your king. She reached out with trembling hands and took a piece of bread, tearing it slowly. Steam rose from the soft interior. She brought it to her lips and took a bite, and the sound she made, somewhere between a sob and a sigh, broke something in Adolphus's chest. When was the last time you ate? He asked quietly. 3 days, my lord. Maybe 4. Adolphus stood, turning away so she wouldn't see the rage on his face. He walked to where Rolf stood, the captain's expression carefully neutral but his eyes knowing. Rolf had served with him long enough to read every mood, every shift. Gather the full guard, Adolphus ordered, his voice low and lethal. Battle ready. We ride for Folkrane's estate at dawn. All of them, sire? Every single one. Adolphus's hands clenched into fists. I want Folkrane to see what real power looks like. I want him to understand that he's been playing games with forces he can't comprehend. And I want everyone in that estate, every corrupt administrator, every complicit official, to know that the reckoning has come. It will be done. Rolf hesitated, then added, and the woman? Adolphus glanced back at Otsana, who was eating slowly, savoring every bite as tears streamed down her face. She was surrounded by warmth and food and safety, things she should have had all along. Things he should have ensured she had. She stays here tonight, in the guest quarters. Full protection detail. And tomorrow, his expression hardened into something that made even Rolf take a step back. Tomorrow, she gets to watch me tear down the system that broke her. Your Majesty, Petrick called out from where he still lay on the floor, his voice desperate. Lord Folkrane has connections. Other nobles support him. If you move against him publicly, there could be political repercussions. Adolphus crossed the distance to the clerk in 3 strides. He grabbed Petrick by the collar and hauled him up until they were face to face. I am the Alpha King, Adolphus said, each word precisely enunciated, dripping with threat. I unified this kingdom through blood and fire. I broke armies. I shattered alliances. I rewrote the very definition of power. He brought Petrick closer until the clerk could feel his breath. Do you really think I'm afraid of political repercussions? And no, Your Majesty. Good. Adolphus released him, letting him drop back to the floor. Because the only thing anyone should fear is what happens when they mistake my patience for weakness. When they confuse my desire for peace with an inability to wage war. He turned to address the entire hall, the guards, the servants, everyone who had gathered to witness this strange scene. Spread the word, he commanded. The Alpha King has remembered his purpose. Justice returns to this kingdom. And anyone, noble or commoner, administrator or merchant, who has been exploiting my people, stealing in my name, corrupting my edicts, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Your time is over. The hall erupted in activity as servants and guards rushed to carry out his orders. Only Rolf remained, standing beside his king, watching the old woman eat her first real meal in days. It's a dangerous path you're walking, Rolf said quietly. The nobles won't like having their autonomy questioned. The nobles can challenge me if they dare, Adolphus replied. But they know as well as I do what happens when someone challenges the Alpha. There's a reason I hold this crown, Rolf. It's not because I was given it. It's because I took it. And I can take it again from anyone foolish enough to forget that. Even so, this could spark. What? Adolphus turned to face his captain, his friend, the only man who'd stood beside him since the beginning. Rebellion? Unrest? Chaos? He gestured toward Otsana. Look at her, Rolf. Really look. That's what my peace has bought. That's what my rule has created. A war widow starving in the ruins while corrupt officials throw parties with stolen gold. He shook his head, something like self-loathing in his expression. I thought I was building something better. I thought if I could just hold the kingdom together, keep the packs from tearing each other apart, eventually prosperity would trickle down to everyone. His laugh was bitter. But prosperity doesn't trickle. It flows to those with power, and it stays there unless someone forces it to move. So you're going to force it. I'm going to burn down everything that stands in the way of justice, Adolphus said simply. And then I'm going to rebuild it correctly this time. From the bottom up, not the top down. Rolf studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're not the same king who walked out into the rain tonight. No, Adolphus agreed, his hand unconsciously moving to the coin still tucked in his armor. That king was broken. Maybe this one can be fixed. From her chair by the fire, Otsana spoke, her voice soft but clear. You were never broken, my lord. Just sleeping. Sometimes even the strongest need to rest before they can rise again. Adolphus turned to look at her, this small, frail woman who had somehow changed the course of a kingdom with a single act of compassion. Then consider me awake, he said, and ready to remind this kingdom what it means to serve an alpha. The fire crackled. The rain continued outside. And in the great hall of the castle, a king and a beggar woman shared a meal, while plans for revolution, for justice, for redemption took shape in the shadows. Tomorrow, the kingdom would learn what happened when you stole from the Alpha's pack. Tomorrow, Boris Vokraine would learn the true meaning of fear. But tonight, an old woman finally ate in peace, surrounded by warmth and safety, her faith in the crown she'd never stopped believing in finally, impossibly rewarded. And that, Adolphus decided, was worth whatever chaos tomorrow would bring. The guest quarters were more luxurious than anything Otsana had ever experienced. A four-poster bed with clean linens. A fireplace with actual wood burning in it. A basin of warm water and clean cloths. The servants had brought her a simple but clean dress to replace her rags, and for the first time in years, she felt almost human again. But sleep wouldn't come. She sat by the window, looking out over the moonlit courtyard, her mind churning with everything that had happened. The coin. The collectors. The king himself carrying her like she was something precious rather than disposable. A soft knock at the door made her jump. It's just me, came Adolphus's voice, muffled through the thick wood. May I enter? Of course, my lord, she called, standing quickly, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. Adolphus entered, having removed most of his armor. He wore a simple tunic and trousers now, though his presence still filled the room. He carried 2 cups and a bottle of what looked like wine. I thought you might have questions, he said, settling into the chair opposite hers. And I have many of my own. He poured wine into both cups and offered her one. She took it with trembling hands, the warmth of the metal cup seeping into her cold fingers. The people of the lower quarter, Adolphus began, his voice careful. What do they believe about me? About their king? Otsana hesitated, her instinct to protect herself warring with the need to speak truth. But looking at his eyes, those weary, desperate eyes, she found she couldn't lie. They believe you've abandoned them, my lord. Adolphus flinched as though she'd struck him. They say the war changed you, she continued, the words coming faster now. That you only care about power now, about keeping your throne. They say the tax collectors work for you, that the starvation is your punishment for the lower quarter's resistance during the unification. Resistance. Adolphus's brow furrowed. The lower quarter supported my claim. They were among the first to bend the knee. I know, my lord. But that's what Vokraine's people tell them. That you remember the district as troublesome, that you're teaching them a lesson about loyalty. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Most don't even use your name anymore. They just call you the Iron Wolf. The monster who takes and never gives back. Adolphus set down his cup with shaking hands. His face had gone pale beneath his beard, his eyes haunted. They think I'm starving them deliberately, he said, the words hollow. They think their suffering is my will. Yes, my lord. And yet you still approached me. Still gave me your coin. Otsana smiled sadly. Because I remembered a different king. The one who came to our village after the war, who knelt in the mud beside my husband's grave and promised that his sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Who swore that the kingdom would be better, fairer, kinder. She reached across and placed her weathered hand on his. I thought if I could remind you of that king, maybe he'd come back. Adolphus looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. I've failed you. All of you. You didn't fail us, my lord. You were lied to. Used. But now you know. Her grip tightened. Now you can fix it. They'll never believe me, he said, his voice raw. Why would they? For years, men have come in my name to steal from them, hurt them, destroy them. Words won't fix that. Promises mean nothing when trust is dead. Then don't use words, Oksana said simply. Show them. Bring Boris Vokrain to justice where everyone can see. Show them that their king hasn't abandoned them, that he was simply blind, but now he sees. Adolphus stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. Tomorrow, the kingdom learns the truth. All of it. His jaw set with determination. And Vokrain learns what happens when you steal from the Alpha's pack. Dawn broke gray and cold over the castle. In the council chamber, 5 regional administrators sat around the long table, summoned by urgent royal decree. They were nervous. Such summons usually meant either war or scandal, and neither was good for their comfortable positions. Boris Vokrain sat at the far end, his sleek frame draped in expensive velvet, his fingers adorned with rings that caught the candlelight. He was handsome in a predatory way, with sharp features and calculating eyes that constantly assessed and evaluated. At 43, he'd risen to power through a combination of charm, ruthlessness, and a talent for telling people what they wanted to hear. Beside him sat Councilman Farkas Runfell, a thin, nervous man who handled the kingdom's financial records. His ink-stained fingers drummed anxiously on the table. The doors opened. Adolphus entered, wearing his full ceremonial armor, the polished plate that was only brought out for formal occasions. Rolf followed, along with 4 other guards. Oksana was there too, dressed in a simple but clean gown, standing quietly near the back of the room. Vokrain's eyes flickered to her, then away, showing no recognition. Good. He didn't see her as a threat. My lords, Adolphus began, settling into his throne-like chair at the head of the table. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I've been reviewing the tax revenues from your districts, and I have concerns. The administrators shifted uneasily. Vokrain leaned forward, his expression perfectly crafted into one of concerned attention. Concerns, Your Majesty? The numbers don't align with what I expected, Adolphus said, his tone deliberately vague. Given the relief edicts I signed, I anticipated lower collections but higher loyalty scores. Instead, I'm seeing complaints. Unrest. The people are always complaining, sire, Vokrain said smoothly. It's their nature. We've been diligent in enforcing your tax codes, but some districts simply refuse to pay their fair share. The lower quarter especially, Farkas added quickly. They've been particularly troublesome. Troublesome, Adolphus repeated, his eyes fixing on Vokrain. How so? Resistance to lawful collection, Your Majesty. They claim they can't pay, but we've found hidden stores, undeclared incomes. They're gaming the system. I see. Adolphus steepled his fingers. And the relief edicts? How have you implemented those? Vokrain didn't miss a beat. We've handled them as written, Your Majesty. Though I must say, the language was somewhat ambiguous. We had to interpret the intent. Interpret. Yes, sire. Obviously, you couldn't have meant for the poorest districts to pay nothing. The kingdom needs revenue for defense, for infrastructure. So we implemented a sliding scale, reduced rates rather than full exemptions. I see, Adolphus said again, his voice dangerously neutral. And the revenues generated from these interpretations, where have they been allocated? To district improvements, Your Majesty, Farkas jumped in, pulling out a ledger. New roads, building repairs, administrative costs. Show me. Farkas slid the ledger across the table. Adolphus made a show of studying it, though Rolf had already reviewed the real books they'd recovered from Petrick. These numbers were fiction, carefully crafted lies. These figures seem remarkably precise, Adolphus observed. Almost too precise. Tell me, Lord Vaucrain, when was the last time you personally visited the lower quarter? Vaucrain's smile never wavered. 2 weeks ago, Your Majesty. I toured the market district, spoke with merchants, assessed the situation. And what did you find? Progress, sire. Slow, but steady. The people are adjusting to the new order. Adjusting, Adolphus echoed. He stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a storm taking shape. Would you say the people of the lower quarter are prospering under your administration? Given the circumstances, yes, Your Majesty. As much as can be expected. Then you'll be pleased to meet one of your constituents. Adolphus gestured to Otsana. Come forward, please. Otsana stepped into the light, and Vaucrain's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been recognition. Or concern. This is Otsana Ravaran, Adolphus said. A war widow from the lower quarter. Tell these gentlemen about your prosperity, Otsana. Tell them about the progress you've witnessed. Otsana's voice was quiet, but steady. I live in a shack with no roof. I haven't eaten a proper meal in 4 days. Lord Vaucrain's collectors come every week demanding taxes I can't pay. They took my furniture, my clothes, everything. Vaucrain's smile strained. Your Majesty, one anecdotal case doesn't. How much do you pay in taxes, Otsana? Adolphus interrupted. 10 silver a week, my lord. Sometimes more. And your income? I have none, my lord. I'm too old to work. Adolphus turned to Vaucrain, his eyes like frozen steel. Explain to me how a war widow with no income is paying 10 silver a week in a district where my relief edicts should exempt her from all taxation. There must be some mistake. There is, Adolphus agreed. The mistake was trusting you to implement my orders faithfully. He nodded to Rolf, who stepped forward with a different ledger, the real one, recovered from Petrick. These are the actual collection records. The ones you didn't burn. They show collections 3 times higher than what you've reported. Where did that money go, Lord Vaucrain? The room went deadly silent. Vaucrain's facade finally cracked. His smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. You're questioning my loyalty? After everything I've done for this kingdom. I'm questioning your theft, Adolphus said flatly. You've been embezzling tax revenues, falsifying records, and using my name to brutalize the very people I swore to protect. That's absurd. Is it? Adolphus moved around the table with predatory grace. Then explain the estate. Explain the parties. Explain the 40-room mansion you've built in the past 3 years on an administrator's salary. Vaucrain stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. I will not stand here and be accused of. You'll stand where I tell you to stand, Adolphus snarled, his voice dropping to a growl that made even the other administrators flinch. You're under arrest for embezzlement, falsification of royal documents, and abuse of office. You will stand trial before the kingdom. Trial? Vaucrain laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think the other nobles will let you prosecute me? I have supporters, Your Majesty. Friends in high places. You move against me, you'll start a civil war. Then let it start, Adolphus said simply. I unified this kingdom once. I can do it again. Guards. Rolf barked. 2 soldiers moved to seize Vaucrain. That's when everything went wrong. Vaucrain's hand moved to his belt, pulling out a small whistle. He blew, a sharp, piercing note that echoed through the chamber. From the hallway outside came the sound of running feet. The doors burst open and 8 men in unmarked armor flooded in. Vaucrain's personal guards, smuggled into the castle under false pretenses. Kill the king, Vaucrain shouted, already moving toward the back exit. And bring me the old woman. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Adolphus didn't hesitate. His sword cleared its sheath in a blur of motion, the blade singing as it cut through the first attacker's guard and bit deep into his shoulder. The man went down screaming. Rolf and the royal guards engaged immediately, steel clashing against steel. But Vaucrain's men were professionals, well-trained and desperate. They knew failure meant death. 2 of them broke away from the main fight, heading straight for Otsana. Adolphus saw them coming. He threw his sword, the blade spinning end over end to bury itself in one attacker's spine. The man dropped instantly. Then Adolphus was moving, covering the distance to Otsana in 3 massive strides. The second attacker reached her first, grabbing her arm. Otsana cried out. Adolphus's fist caught the man in the temple with the force of a battering ram. The attacker's head snapped sideways with a sickening crack, and he crumpled, dead before he hit the ground. Behind me, Adolphus commanded, positioning himself between Otsana and the remaining attackers. He pulled a dagger from his belt, his last weapon. Rolf. The woman. Going for Vokraine. Rolf shouted back, cutting down another attacker. He's running. Let him. Adolphus blocked a sword strike with his armored forearm, then drove his dagger up under his attacker's chin. I want him scared. The fight was brutal and short. Adolphus fought with the savage efficiency of a man who'd spent decades in warfare, every move economical and lethal. Without his sword, he used his armor as a weapon, smashing heads, breaking bones, turning his entire body into an instrument of destruction. When the last of Vokraine's guards fell, the council chamber looked like an abattoir. Blood pooled on the polished floor. Bodies lay twisted in death. And Adolphus stood in the center of it all, breathing hard, spattered with gore, his eyes blazing with fury. Clear the castle, he ordered. Find Vokraine. I want him alive. Sire. One of the guards called from the doorway. He fled toward the stables. He's making for his estate. Adolphus smiled, and it was a terrible thing, all teeth and promise of violence. Good. Let him run home. Let him gather his supporters. He turned to Rolf. Summon the full guard. Battle formation. We're going to end this publicly. The Grand Plaza? The Grand Plaza. Adolphus looked at Otsana, who stood pale but unharmed. The people think their king has abandoned them. Time to show them the truth. By midday, word had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The Alpha King was calling for a trial by combat. Boris Vokraine was accused of high crimes. The entire lower quarter was summoned to witness justice. The Grand Plaza, the massive open square at the kingdom's heart, filled with people. Thousands of them, packed shoulder to shoulder. The poor from the slums mixed with merchants and nobles, all drawn by the spectacle. At the plaza's center, Adolphus stood in full battle armor, his sword planted in the ground before him. Behind him, arrayed in perfect formation, stood 300 royal guards. The kingdom's military might on display. Rolf brought Vokraine forward in chains. The administrator's sleek appearance was ruined, his hair disheveled, his fine clothes torn from his desperate flight. But his eyes still held defiance. Boris Vokraine, Adolphus's voice boomed across the plaza, magically amplified so all could hear. You stand accused of embezzlement, falsification of documents, abuse of authority, and crimes against the people of this kingdom. How do you answer? I am innocent, Vokraine declared. I've served this kingdom faithfully. This is a political persecution. Then you challenge the king's justice? I do. Vokraine straightened, playing to the crowd now. I invoke the ancient right. Trial by combat. Let the gods decide who speaks truth. The crowd murmured. This was unexpected. Trial by combat was rare, reserved for cases where honor was at stake. Adolphus smiled coldly. I accept. Choose your champion. I need no champion, Vokraine said. I'll fight myself. That drew gasps. Vokraine was no warrior. He was a bureaucrat, soft from years of luxury. You're certain? Adolphus asked. Once the challenge is accepted, there can be no withdrawal. I'm certain. Vokraine's eyes gleamed. Unless you're afraid, Your Majesty? Perhaps you'd rather have one of your guards fight in your stead. Adolphus's laugh was genuine, touched with dark amusement. You think I became Alpha King by letting others fight my battles? He pulled his sword from the ground, the blade catching the sunlight. No, Lord Vokraine. I'll handle this personally. Rolf unlocked Vokraine's chains and handed him a sword. Vokraine took it, testing the weight, finding his balance. Before we begin, Adolphus said, his voice still carrying across the plaza. I want the people to know the truth. He gestured, and Rolf's men brought forward 3 large chests. They opened them, revealing gold coins, thousands of them, glinting in the sunlight. This, Adolphus declared, is the tax revenue Boris Vaucrain stole from you. Money that should have gone to rebuilding your homes, to feeding your families, to honoring the relief edicts I signed. The crowd roared anger, disbelief, rage. He told you the king was starving you, Adolphus continued. He told you I'd abandoned you. He used my name to justify his cruelty. His voice softened, but somehow became even more powerful. I am guilty of negligence, of being too distant from my people, of trusting men I should have watched more carefully. For that, I apologize. The plaza went silent. An Alpha King did not apologize. Kings did not admit fault. But this man, Adolphus pointed his sword at Vaucrain, is guilty of far worse. And now he'll answer for it. Vaucrain lunged. It was a desperate, clumsy attack, the move of a man who knew his only chance was to end things quickly, before his lack of skill became apparent. Adolphus didn't even bother to parry. He simply stepped aside, letting Vaucrain's momentum carry him past. The administrator stumbled, nearly falling. Is that your best? Adolphus asked quietly. Vaucrain spun, slashing wildly. This time Adolphus blocked, his sword meeting Vaucrain's with a clang that echoed across the plaza. With a twist of his wrist, he disarmed Vaucrain, sending the administrator's sword clattering across the cobblestones. Vaucrain scrambled for it, but Adolphus's boot came down on the blade. Yield, Adolphus said. Confess your crimes before the kingdom, and I'll grant you a clean death. Never, Vaucrain snarled. I won't give you the satisfaction. Adolphus's fist crashed into Vaucrain's jaw, dropping him to his knees. Then he grabbed the administrator by the throat, lifting him so the entire plaza could see. You will confess, Adolphus said, his voice cold as winter. Because I'm not offering you mercy. I'm offering you a choice. Confess and die quickly, or refuse, and I'll let the people you brutalized decide your fate. He gestured to the crowd, where faces from the lower quarter watched with hungry, hate-filled eyes. Vaucrain's defiance crumbled. He saw his death in those faces, not clean, not quick, but slow and agonizing. I confess, he choked out. I stole the taxes. Falsified the records. I did it all. Why? Because I could. Vaucrain's voice rose to a shriek. Because you were too busy being the big, scary Alpha King to pay attention. Because the system was there to be exploited. Adolphus dropped him. Vaucrain collapsed to the cobblestones, sobbing. The system, Adolphus said, addressing the crowd once more, is broken. I see that now. And I'm going to fix it. He turned to face the thousands of people packed into the plaza. Starting today, all taxes are suspended for 6 months in the lower quarter. This gold, he gestured to the recovered chests, will be distributed among those who suffered under Vaucrain's corruption. War widows and veterans will receive full pensions, backdated to when they should have begun. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Adolphus raised his hand for silence. More than that, I'm establishing a new position, the people's advocate. Someone whose only job is to bring your grievances directly to me, bypassing the bureaucrats and administrators who've proven themselves corrupt. He paused. And the first advocate will be Otsana Ravrin. Gasps rippled through the plaza as Otsana was brought forward. She looked terrified, but also resolute. This woman, Adolphus said, placing his hand on her shoulder, gave a starving man her last coin. Reminded a broken king what he was supposed to be. If anyone understands the suffering of the people, it's her. And if anyone has earned the right to speak truth to power, it's her. He knelt then, the Alpha King, kneeling before a war widow in front of the entire kingdom. I failed you, he said, loud enough for all to hear. I let my isolation blind me to your pain. I let corrupt men use my name as a weapon against you. That ends today. He stood, turning to Rolf. Take Vaucrain to the dungeons. His sentence will be decided by those he victimized. As Vakrane was dragged away, still sobbing, Adolphus addressed the crowd one final time. I am your king, your alpha, and I have forgotten what that truly means. His voice rang with conviction. An alpha doesn't just take. He provides. He protects. He serves the pack, not himself. He drew his sword and held it high, the blade catching the sunlight. This kingdom was built on blood and sacrifice. Your blood. Your sacrifice. No more will that be forgotten. No more will you suffer in silence, while those who should protect you prey upon you instead. The crowd roared its approval, the sound like thunder. Justice has returned to this kingdom, Adolphus declared. And I swear on my crown, on my sword, on everything I hold sacred, never again will the Alpha abandon his pack. 3 days later, as evening settled over the castle, Adolphus found himself in a small dining room, not the great hall, but an intimate space with a single table and a crackling fire. Across from him sat Otsana, wearing her new robes of office, simple but dignified, marked with the People's Advocate seal. Between them lay a modest meal, fresh bread, roasted chicken, vegetables, and wine. I still can't believe this is real, Otsana said, tears in her eyes. 3 days ago, I was starving. Now I'm dining with the king. You did more than dine with the king, Adolphus corrected gently. You saved him. He pulled something from his pocket, the coronation coin, now polished and gleaming. He set it on the table between them. You told me to eat, he said quietly. To fill the emptiness. I didn't understand then what you meant. I thought you were talking about food. And now? Now I understand you were talking about something deeper. He picked up the coin, turning it in his fingers. I was hollow inside. Broken, as you said. I'd forgotten why I fought for this kingdom. I'd let the crown become a burden instead of a responsibility. He reached across and placed the coin in her palm, closing her fingers around it. Keep it, he said, as a reminder. Not of what was, but of what can be. A kingdom where the strong protect the weak. Where justice flows to all, not just the powerful. Where an old woman can give her last coin to a stranger and inspire a revolution. Otsana smiled through her tears. You were never broken, my lord. Just sleeping. All you needed was someone to wake you up. Then consider me awake. Adolphus picked up his cup, raising it in a toast. To new beginnings. To justice. To the pack. To the pack, Otsana echoed, clinking her cup against his. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the castle settling around them. Outside, the kingdom was changing slowly but surely. Reforms were being implemented. Corrupt officials were being removed. The people were beginning to hope again. And in that small dining room, a king who'd been lost in darkness finally found his way back to the light, guided by the simple compassion of a woman who'd seen past his armor to the broken soul beneath. For the first time in 10 years, Adolphus Varker smiled, not the cold, calculated expression he wore for his enemies, but a genuine smile, warm and real. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing me when no one else could. Thank you, Otsana replied, for remembering who you were meant to be. The meal she'd paid for, the meal that had cost her everything but given him back his soul, finally shared in peace. The broken king, fixed at last. And the kingdom, silent no more, roared with the sound of justice reclaimed.